Okay, it's National Mentoring Month, everybody. How
Yay.
hard to believe we're 3 weeks in to 2025 to National Mentoring Month. And I could not be more delighted and honored to have our guests with us today. For those who have joined us in past years, you know that we like to talk to people who have had mentoring relationships for extended period of time to learn from them, some of what they've learned from one another and see what our takeaways can be to improve our own mentoring relationships and our own mentoring practices. Let me introduce Dr. Kathy Kram, who is the R.C. Shipley Professor in Management Emerita at Boston University and a pioneer in mentoring, leadership development, and relational learning. If you were to look on my bookshelves, I would think every third or fourth book, if it's not written in some way by Kathy, it certainly cites to Kathy and her seminal work in mentoring. She's earned her BS and MS in management from MIT and her MA and PhD in organizational psychology from Yale. She is the author of Mentoring at Work and the co-author of several influential books, including Retiring, Creating a Life That Works for You, which she and Tim have recently released. Her groundbreaking research and consulting work continue to shape how individuals and organizations approach mentorship, developmental networks, and career transitions. And her mentor, Dr. Tim Hall, is the Morton H. and Charlotte Friedman Professor of Management and Director of Executive Development Roundtable at Boston University School of Management. He's a renowned expert in career development and organizational behavior and has authored numerous influential books, including The Career is Dead, Long Live the Career, and Careers in and Out of Organizations. He received multiple prestigious awards, including the Academy of Management's Everett Hughes Award of Career Research, and he's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Academy of Management. And Kathy and Tim recently released, as I said, Retiring, Creating a Life That Works for You. We'll put in the chat a link to a recent interview that was just released, the two of them through Boston University as well. Kathy, Tim, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you,
Thank
Lisa.
you.
Yeah.
Would love to just dig in and find out a little bit more about your mentoring relationship. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first met and how you decided to enter into mentoring?
Well, that's such a good question, and I imagine Tim may not know this, but the first time I met Tim was when I was a graduate student and went to my first professional meeting at the Academy of Management. And Tim was spearheading a research group on careers. And I was delighted to see him in person because I had already been reading his writing on careers and career development. And it just so happened a few years later, I was searching for my first academic job, and Tim was searching to make a change. And we both made a decision to go to Boston University. So we really met on the phone, at least, in our separate inquiries into what it would be like to be at Boston University, and then we both decided to go there. That's how I remember our beginning. There was never a conscious decision, on my part at least, that I wanted Tim to be my mentor. I just knew I was very excited to be going to a faculty where there was someone else whose work I really admired. So I was looking forward to getting to know him. And at that same time, I was writing my dissertation on mentoring. Of course, when you're doing research, you don't always see the immediate applications, but clearly I was preparing for a relationship of this import, I think. Yeah.
How do you remember it, Tim?
Um, pretty much the same way. Um, as I thought about that question ahead of time, I couldn't remember exactly when we had met in person together. Um, and but it would make sense that we might have met at the Academy of Management meeting sometime, because that was a time when everybody went. That is our main professional association, and this was before COVID, obviously before Zoom, and so you would go in person
Yeah.
to those events. And So if you were looking for a job then, that would have been around 1979 or so, I guess.
Right.
And that was probably when we were meeting informally. There was a group of people interested in careers in the academy,
Exactly.
and we were meeting to talk about the possibility of creating a careers division in the academy. There hadn't been anything related to careers in the academy before that. So that was probably our founding meeting. But the time I was first really aware of Kathy was when I was spending a visiting year, splitting my time between Columbia's School of Business and the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And at the time, I was on the faculty of the Kellogg School at Northwestern. And I really wanted to come back east again. I was from the east. My parents were getting older. My mother had just had a heart attack. It took me a day and a half to get home to be with her. And I wanted to be closer to my family. I'm an only child, and so I was looking for jobs, and I was talking to the folks at Columbia about going there, and I was sitting in on a faculty meeting, and it happened to be one where they were talking about their recruiting, and they had this list of doctoral students that they were interested in. And the person discussing it, I forget who, it may have been Mike Tushman at that time, Kathy, I don't know, but someone we both know, maybe Noel Tishy. Anyway, he said, well, here's our list. Here are our top three candidates. The first one is Kathy Kram, and we all had her vita, and I was really interested in her vita. And he said, but don't get too excited because we really don't have a chance of getting her. She's thinking about two possibilities. Either she wants to be in LA or in the Boston area. And he said something like, we're dealing with a relational problem here. In other words, there was a person in Kathy's life. So geographic location was important. And then later on, when I was talking to people at Boston University about a job, one of the first things they talked about in terms of how they wanted to grow the department was, we've made an offer to Kathy Kram. And I was so impressed that, and I didn't really know any of the candidates on the market. Since I wasn't at my own school, I wasn't involved in it. So of all the people on the market that year, the one person I knew and had very high regard for was being recruited at BU. So, and then we got to talking several times during that process. And Max Bazerman also had an offer, and Fred Folks, who was at Harvard then, also had an offer. And so the four of us, or mainly the three of us, Kathy and Max and I, but as most often it would be Kathy and me comparing notes on what we were thinking at different points in the decision process.
Well, you were thinking in terms of whether to accept an offer or
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and it was not an easy decision to make because BU physically was not an attractive place. It was an old brownstone building. There have been promises of a new new building for the School of Management for a long time, but it never seemed to happen. And it was a very depressing winter. We'd had a lot of snow that was melting, and it really looked sort of unattractive. And even though there was a lot of promise, it was hard to think of it. And there were other offers that were also interesting. So it felt like we were sort of encouraging each other. And then one time we decided, well, we'll go back and take another look in March when the weather is getting better.
Yeah.
And I don't know about your second visit, Kathy, but
It
for
was
me,
terrible.
it was right after another snowstorm. And
Right.
the first thing we both said to each other was, it doesn't look any better.
It's amazing
But
what a
we
difference
ended up going
sunshine and
there.
spring can make, right?
Yeah.
Um, so you started at BU then at the same time.
Right.
We're
Yeah.
classmates.
Mm,
Right. But, I was a novice as faculty member. That was totally new for me. And Tim was recruited as a senior faculty member. Um, and so structurally, we were in a position where, I had the potential to learn a lot from Tim, both about how to publish my research and how to teach and all the basics of the job I was entering for the first time. So it was really, for me, it was a perfect opportunity, and I was excited about the prospects when I learned.
so did you ever kind of formalize a structure to your mentoring relationship?
I don't think so. I don't know, Tim, you might have a different recollection.
No, I
Um,
was really curious what your answer to that question would be.
It kind of startles me on this interview that as a student of mentoring, and I had just spent years researching mentoring, it didn't even occur to me that I could look at my own research and sort of, if I were more aware at the time, I might have said, well, maybe I ought to sit down with Tim and tell him, what I'm looking for in guidance. But that didn't happen. It unfolded quite naturally, and I attribute it to Tim's good listening skills and his caring and his, he knew what it takes to get established, and he thankfully decided to help me do that. So we never formalized it, just we were very complimentary. And I think that's how informal mentoring gets started, two people having complementary interests and needs. I don't know, Tim, what do you think?
I had printed out a list of some of the topics that might be covered in this interview. And I was showing them to my wife, Marcy, who is an OB colleague. She's also a co-author on the book on retirement that Kathy and I
Mm.
were co-authors of. And um, the one question that popped out for Marcy was the one about how did you decide to have a mentoring relationship? She said, you guys never decided to have a mentoring relationship. And yeah, I see it the same way Kathy does, that it to me it just seemed like a mutually um, helpful relationship from the very beginning. As I said, we were helping each other make the decision about whether to go to BU or not.
Mm.
And we got to know each other, and in discussing that, we also got to talk about some of the personal factors we were taking into account in making our decision. And so we just, to me, it seemed like the relationship just developed from there. And also as I was thinking more, I think one of the factors too, and I'd be curious, Kathy, about how you feel about this. I think there was a very developmental culture in our organizational behavior group at Boston University. It was just beginning then, but some of the senior colleagues in our department, Lloyd Baird, um, he had been a student of mine at Michigan State a long time ago, but he's a leader in his church, very developmentally oriented person, really knows about leadership. Other senior faculty in other departments like Jim Post and policy. We had a dean, Henry Morgan, who was one of the leaders in the work family area in business. His wife, Gwen Morgan, was a very active writer and activist around work family flexibility. And later on with other people like Jack McCarthy and Oh, we had Phil Mervis. It was, I don't know, a very congenial group. And I never thought of it in these terms before, but Kathy writes about developmental networks and having a culture for development in an organization. And I think that was the case in our school. And I'm really happy to see Assault Feeney on the call here from Dublin. Hi, Assault. And she spent a year with us as a visiting scholar.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah.
she, I mean, you might have some comments about the sort of culture there, Assault. I know you've worked a lot with Jack McCarthy, but I think the larger environment was certainly very helpful to Kathy and me as well.
Yeah,
Sure, yeah, thanks, Tim, for the mention. I had the pleasure of meeting both of you when I came to stay in BU, and it was a really positive environment. And I'd say of any of the research trips I've ever made in my life, I probably put down roots. So it's the network I think that both of you have, and obviously Jack has gone on to Babson, but I've worked with Dana and Jamie and and Wendy as well. So
Yeah.
it's a very welcoming it was a very welcoming place to come. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
And that's I hadn't really thought about that, but when I think about the work I went on to do, it was so clear to me that in organizations where there is a developmental culture, where people are encouraged and rewarded for taking time to guide other people, mentoring flourishes more, especially the formally assigned mentoring, which can go flat. You must know that, Lisa, from your
Oh
own
yeah.
experience.
Well, for
Yeah.
sure. And I think I mean, what I love the most about that is even today, you still remember the community around you that supported the growth of your relationship with
Yeah.
one another.
Yeah.
It's so generative.
Yes. Yeah.
It really it's amazing. What do you think it was about the environment that made it ripe for this kind of developmental culture?
Well, it was an unusual level of caring
Mm,
and mutual respect. The academic world can be very competitive
hmm
um, and siloed, with people becoming self-protective. And what I remember, and I don't know if it's still like this because we've both been gone for a number of years, but there was a collaborative culture where people really cared about each other and wanted to help each other, which allowed not just this relationship, but other relationships to flourish. Um, I don't know, Tim, if you have other thoughts about
Yeah,
that.
I think so. And I think I think the impact of a developmental culture like that is it's helped by both sort of the hard factors and the soft factors. The soft factors, I think, are the caring and the trust that people had and genuine liking. And there was a feeling that the school was just growing, and it was. And Henry Morgan had just come in as dean, and he was very big in the nonprofit world, and Boston University was known for having programs in public and nonprofit management, health sector management, entrepreneurship, and not just straight business. And that's why it was called the School of Management for a long time, because the focus was not just business. And Henry really was a leader in doing that, and leaders. He knew that developing strong leaders was an important ingredient for an organization to grow. And one specific structural way that showed up was that people got rewarded for doing collaborative research. That was a time, this was 1980,
mm,
and I know at Northwestern, where I'd been before, and also Michigan State, um, there was a strong focus on doing your own research and writing. And for a junior faculty member, if they came up for tenure and had co-authored something with a senior faculty member, the assumption was it was all the senior faculty members' work. That collaborative work was not, it was discounted to a certain extent. And I remember Kathy and I and Max asking in the interview, well, how do you feel about collaborative research? Because all of us like to do team research, collaborative research. And the answer was always, it's the research and the quality of the research. And, you know, we encourage people to work together. And we always figured, well, the proof is in the pudding. Let's see what happens when people like Kathy go up for tenure with some collaborative papers. Well, for Kathy, most of her work was sole authored and her book was sole authored, and it was very clear that she was the force behind the research and writing she was doing. But in other cases as well, and I really felt for myself just in terms of how my work was evaluated. The fact that a lot of it was with other people was either not seen as a negative or was seen as a positive. The second factor, I think, for me, and I hadn't really thought about this before, but I was at a point in my career, I'd been a full professor at Northwestern, I'd been department chair, but I was young. I was 35 years old, I think, and I didn't feel senior. I knew I had the rank, but I remember my first day at the faculty orientation at Northwestern, I met this young economist in the elevator, and he looked at me and said, well, what are you doing your dissertation on? He thought I was a graduate student. But when I was, by 1980, I just turned 40, and for at least two jobs, that the other one being at Dartmouth, I had an offer from the Tuck School at Dartmouth, and I was told by the deans there and senior faculty, part of what they wanted me to do was provide mentoring for junior faculty. Dartmouth at that time didn't have any senior faculty in OB. They had one, but he was dean, and so he was not active in the OB group. And so it would have been a very explicit part of my contract to focus or to be concerned about working with junior faculty. And when I would talk to people like Lloyd Baird and Henry Morgan at BU, they also said, you know, not that that was my main job, but they said, we really see you as somebody who could help develop a group of people doing research. And that I was very happy with that. But having that kind of support for a developmental climate and culture, that made the place much more attractive to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, 1980, if my math is good, that's 45 years ago, and I'm curious how your relationship has evolved over time.
Yeah, I really want to speak to that because as Tim was talking, I was thinking, you know, that scenario that we both entered into was so conducive to forming a relationship. At the same time, I know from my own research that oftentimes mentoring relationships end within 5 years or something, maybe a little longer or shorter, because people's needs get out of sync and the younger person may want to move on and the older person doesn't want to let them go or whatever it might be. And in our relationship, I can see multiple points in time when one or the other of us was shifting in some way. And we are fortunate because we kind of adapted. Again, not really talking about it. It
Mhm.
just happened. I think we have, during those 40 years, we have had some conversations, and I would really promote that to people who are wanting to enable a relationship to evolve with them. And I think that that's what makes long-term relationships possible. So, for example, at some point pretty early on in my time at BU, I realized, probably with Tim's help, that I needed to build other relationships that I could learn from, and I needed to let other people know me and what I'm about so that I wasn't just a student of Tim's or a protege of Tim's, but that I had my own independent identity. And I got a lot of encouragement from Tim for doing that. And he would introduce me to people who otherwise I might not run into. So he provided that kind of exposure and sponsorship that mentors do at critical points in time.
Mhm. I'm so curious about if you can go in a little bit more into what that adaptation looked like. Was it a kind of a formal discussion about the need to adapt? Was it conscious? And then talk about that evolution just a little bit more.
Well, the way I remember it is there were critical points where Tim said things like, have you met so and so? You might want to talk to them because they know about, so, I can't even think of specific examples, but that's how I cultivated relationships with other senior faculty. It's also, recognizing on my own and through my own research how important relationships with my peers were. And that was all in a time when I was discovering the idea of a developmental network, that having one relationship is not as good as having a developmental network of relationships. And by doing that, our relationship could evolve more as each of us evolved. I don't know, Tim, how did you see that?
Yeah, I think an important factor was it was always a mutually beneficial relationship from the very beginning, starting with us, as we were saying, helping each other work through the decision to go to BU, because it also meant giving up some other alternatives that had a lot of attractive features to them. Um, and so I really experienced the full range of kind of peer mentoring functions from Kathy. Um, I I think we were doing peer mentoring for a long time, long before Kathy became a senior faculty member, maybe without realizing it. And she talks about the socio-emotional functions as well as the task functions. And one task function that I remember was when Kathy was thinking about what to do, how to publish her dissertation. And I was saying, oh, you ought to do a book. It'll be a great book. And Kathy, I remember, seemed startled at that time. It's like, really? And it was just perfect in all kinds of ways. It had a very clear focus. The length of it was just about right and very practical, but also very important in terms of new concepts about development. And my sense was at that time, Kathy didn't have the self-concept of a person who could write a book.
Absolutely.
So I felt like I was sort of pushing her a little bit, saying, "No, you can do this. If not you, who?" So things like that. And for me, a critical point. Well, again, in terms of the socio-emotional, the personal development, one was at the very beginning when we were deciding about BU, my marriage was falling apart at that point. And it was a very difficult time for me personally. And I remember one of the factors I was thinking about, and I don't know how much detail I went into with you on that, Kathy, but I think I let you know that things were not going so well, and that was affecting my thinking. And I was thinking, do I want to be a single guy in Hanover, New Hampshire, or a single guy in Boston, Massachusetts? And that was a pretty clear answer. But there are also other factors as well. BU had a doctoral program, Hanover didn't. BU was a big research university, and there were a lot of factors. But the personal ones were, and Kathy understood the importance of being close to my parents, and Boston was closer to where they were in southern New Hampshire. And so, in fact, the marriage did fall apart. Later on, I was divorced. And then fast forward mid 80s, Kathy and Peter invited me to a party at their house one summer. And she introduced me to a colleague from Bentley, Marcy Crary. And so we've been married for 36, 37, 38 years now. So Kathy really, again, she was helpful to me in very important personal ways. She was Marcy's and my Yenta. And then later on, one other thing, I don't want to go on too much longer, but as more people became senior in our department and in the school decided that we would have a senior faculty, a post-tenure development process. Because in most academic settings, once people get tenure, there's really no focus on development. And so we decided that we would have a peer mentoring process. So there'd be pairs of faculty working together as peer mentors. And so Kathy and I decided we would be each other's peer mentors. Well, all that did to me was just sort of formalize what was already there in the relationship. But it continues to this day, because whenever I have a big decision I have to make and I'm not really sure about it, I'll drop Kathy an email, say, I need to have lunch with my peer mentor and talk about this issue. When are you free?
Yeah.
And I find all of that fascinating because, Lisa, I was not aware of this until probably 15 years into our relationship, which is interesting. And it's an important lesson for those in the audience or anyone else from the mentee's perspective, the younger person's perspective. I just didn't have it in my self-concept until Tim actually told me or introduced me to someone as your peer mentor or your peer coach. And this was like 10 years into our relationship.
Mhm.
So I didn't have an awareness of the mutuality of our relationship until then. And I think it's a really obviously important for how the
Yeah.
relationship evolved.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the contributions of your work early on in mentoring, Kathy, was you really identified the fact that a good mentoring relationship really benefits both parties.
Right.
I think up until then, it was seen as something nice that the senior person did for the junior person.
Yeah.
And you identified all the ways in your research that the senior person benefits as well.
Yeah. Right.
I'm so struck by so much of this story. One of them is, the blurring of lines between what is personal and what is professional, and how these relationships really impact all parts of your life. In your case, Tim, introducing you to your wife. So
Hmm.
not always quite that stark, but you see that more and more of how the benefits of these mentoring relationships translate into the personal as
Hmm.
well as into the professional. But also, Kathy, your point about self-concept and understanding your role with one another. I want to uh, shift on that a little bit and just talk about what you've learned from one another. We always say that learning is the purpose, the process, and the product of mentoring at its heart. And you've had a lot of time and conversations. So I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit about what you've learned about yourself from the relationship and what you've learned about one another.
Well, wow. My self-concept really changed as a result of my relationship with Tim. And I do remember very clearly the day when you, Tim, said, "Why don't you write a book?" I mean, honestly, it had never occurred to me that my work might warrant a book.
Well,
And
you'd
that,
already published a great article from it,
right, exactly. I
and then
remember.
another one.
Yeah. So, um, I think that continued to happen as I took on more responsibility, and then I became a effective teacher, and I started mentoring people coming up behind me. All of that, my self-concept just continued to expand and enrich. And even to this day, I get a real kick out of Tim initiating a call and saying, "I need a peer coaching discussion." It reminds me of how far I've come and how I can see my own effectiveness in the world so much better. Um, and in terms, I also feel that Tim's willingness to be self-reflective and self-disclosing is an important force in how our relationship evolved, because I think I can get stuck in assumptions about what's appropriate and what's not. And it was through his openness that I could move forward and become helpful in other ways, both to Tim and to other people. Yeah.
Beautiful. Tim, your thoughts?
Um, yeah, that's that's really a difficult question for me to answer, and it's one that I ask other people a lot about, what did you learn, or and I think, well, there's obviously the assistance in dealing with emotional issues or making decisions, and so, but in terms of personal development, I think it was the implicit messages I got from Kathy, just her way of being in relation to me. I think that helped me really come to see myself and integrate it into my sense of self as a senior respected person in our academic community. Um, and it wasn't anything explicit that she said. It was just treating me with respect. And I, I, I can't think of specific examples, but also it was the the positive regard that Kathy showed. I know one of my heroes is Carl Rogers, and I love his book on becoming a person. And he talks about the characteristics of a helping relationship. And the most important part is the helper having unconditional positive regard for the other person.
Mm.
And I always have that sense with Kathy that no matter what happened, I've never felt negatively evaluated. I've never felt judged by Kathy. And there are other people where I have felt judged. And I think Kathy knows, even on the project we did,
Right.
But with Kathy, I would always look forward to getting together. I was never concerned about, well, are there some feelings she's having about me that she's not talking about, or will she say something that would make me feel bad or something? So it was just that unconditional regard coming back. And again, I think that's a really important part of a mentoring relationship, where the other person just feels valued as a person. And I've had other relationships with more junior people, which they probably saw as helpful to them in some ways. Nothing like the range of the long-term relationship Kathy and I had, but I've had other relationships where I did get a sense that they were treating me as, quote, a senior person who could be helpful to them in some way. And those could be mutually helpful relationships as well. But there was never any sense of that with Kathy, that, she had a motive, and that was the reason why, the relationship was going forward.
Hmm. That it's sort of the je ne sais quoi of trust building, right? If I imagine that if I were to ask you the question of how do you form a relationship, what do you do to avoid judgment and share this unconditional regard? I think that probably is a pretty hard thing to pinpoint.
Yes.
Yeah, it
Right.
is.
Yeah.
But it's so important.
Yeah.
Probably the longevity of this relationship as well. Um, Let me ask you, if you were to give advice uh, to new mentees and new mentors entering into a relationship who had the hopes of having the kind of longevity of a mentoring relationship that the two of you have had, what advice would you give?
Um, well, I think I mentioned this earlier, that I think being aware as a new mentee of what you might bring to the relationship. Because I think as a new mentee, I remember, well, I felt so in need of support and guidance, and I was not thinking at all about what I might have to offer Tim or to other senior people that I was getting to know. So that's part of it. And from my point of view, Tim's self-disclosure and self-awareness really helped me not only get to know him, but to see in action how important those qualities are to building a relationship. It became a focus of my work later on, actually, to acknowledge how that kind of self-awareness really and self-disclosure actually sets mentoring relationships in motion. And it has to be on both sides for the kind of depth of connection that we ultimately experienced. It can't be one-sided. So that's my thought about it. And I think the only other thing I would add, I mean, there's nothing I would go back and do differently, but I do think acknowledging the mutuality in the relationship at some point can really be helpful.
Mhm.
To really say, yeah, we've developed a relationship here and a mutual helping that serves us both really well. And that doesn't happen. Sometimes in formal mentoring programs, they suggest that you have periodic check-ins,
Mhm.
and it would be for that purpose, I think. Yeah.
Tim?
I guess I would say don't think of a long-term relationship as being the goal. um,
Right.
and think more in terms of just forming a good relationship that involves work as well as some of the personal side, friendship, uh, and and give what you can, give what is needed, and when you need something, be willing to ask or communicate somehow that this would be helpful to you, and see where it goes. And if it continues, great. And and also look forward to seeing the person grow. So when they move up, they get promoted, they become more senior. That's something you can both enjoy together. It doesn't become a threat to your role in the relationship. And recognize some of the challenges that either of you would have along the way, whether personal or professional. Those challenges, if you can get through them, can really build a relationship. Certainly, when Kathy introduced me to Marcy, that was for Marcy and me. Our relationship with Kathy and Peter is a very important part of our life together. But there was a time when, a couple of times for different reasons, there was a possibility that Kathy might go get another job somewhere else. And so being able to sort of be together with that, and for me on the things I could do to help with that so that she stayed at BU. They were important things to do at the time. And then when they worked out well, it was like we had this mutual success experience together. And so that just really kind of built the relationship some more.
Powerful. I want to give some time if anyone has any questions or comments to share those. And as people are thinking about that, I want to also just give you a chance. You both came out with a book that I know you co-authored with several others called Retiring, Creating a Life That Works for You. Can you just tell us a little bit about what caused you to write that and what the nature of that book is?
Well, it's interesting because we both were thinking about the retirement stage of life for academic reasons. And then it became personal, especially for me. I decided I was ready to leave the university. So Teresa Amabile initiated a conversation with Tim, and Tim said, how about I bring my colleague Kathy? And before we knew it, we had this 10-year project, which involved interviewing over 200 people about the transition into retirement. So the book is a collection of in-depth cases of 14 people that we met before they retired and followed them through their retirement process. And it just came out in December, and it basically says retirement is a challenge and an opportunity. It's hard work. And we lay out the kind of work psychologically and structurally that has to happen in order for people to develop a post-retirement life that's satisfying.
And some of the qualities that we found are important to that are some of the things we've talked about today. As we look back at the data with the interviews, the case studies we had, there were 4 A's that we
Oh, that's right.
found. And one is what we've been talking about a lot today, awareness. Awareness of oneself as well as others and the environment. Another is adaptability. So we've talked about how relationships change and grow over time and how the people in the relationships can grow, change over time. And then agency, the idea of being kind of conscious of making your own decisions driven by your own values, things that are most important to you, being proactive, and alignment, really thinking in terms of how comfortable do I feel in this current environment, in these relationships, in this job, in this location, in this home where I'm living, etc. And that the people who made, I think, successful transitions, and I'd say just they all did basically. I mean, the facts are friendly, I think, as Carl Rogers again would say, the facts are friendly. People find ways to make that transition work well for them. And looking back, those transitions are very similar to a lot of other transitions that we've made earlier in our lives, professionally and personally. It's not unique to retirement.
Mm-hmm. Tim, I saw you held the book up. Hold it up again, please, because it was while Kathy was speaking, and I'm not sure that the Zoom will have captured it. I want people to see.
I don't know if it shows up.
Yeah, it's good.
It does. Great. Thank you so much. Any takeaways? I know for me, I'm struck with this idea of how this kind of relationship can really affect one's self-concept and just pervade in areas of your life. There's a ripple effect, it seems, for both of you of how this has impacted your career. Other takeaways? Yeah,
Can I
please.
just come in, Lisa, because it was just beautiful listening to the flow in this mentoring relationship. The longest mentoring relationship I had was with David Megginson, who Kathy will remember.
Oh, yeah.
Who I worked with for many years at Sheffield Hallam in the Coaching Mentoring Research Unit. And that had a flow during the 20 years until David died. And just listening to the beauty of it, of how it sort of ebbed and flowed at times, the peer mentoring aspect, the way it sort of overcame boundaries. I spend a lot of time training and developing mentors and coaches, and we're always very careful about boundaries and what we cover in the relationships, etc. But I just thought it was exquisite listening to the development of your relationship. So thank you. It's been a marvelous session.
Thank you.
Glad it was helpful.
Wonderful. Cheryl says that she should continue to look at more ways to contribute to her mentors. And Maribel says Tim's sharing about his recognizing and motivating Kathy to write a book made tangible the saying that mentors see more in you than you see in yourself.
I love that. That's a great observation.
Yeah.
Kathy and Tim, this was just such a joy and a delight and an honor for me. Thank you. I hope it gave you some time to reflect on. I know it's been a meaningful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks
really
for the opportunity.
Enjoyable.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Encourage you to grab a copy of Kathy and Tim's new book or any of the wonderful books that they've each contributed to their respective fields. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
During month.
Thank you, Lisa.
Bye-bye.
Michelle, thank you.